During the war between Zeus and his father, the Titan Cronus, a war known famously as the Titanochemy, you would be forgiven for thinking that Cronus, the child-devouring monster of a god, was the big bad boss of the battle. However, there was yet another Titan who had adopted this role and served as the leader of all other Titans in the war against the rebellious Zeus. Indeed, Zeus's most ferocious and deadly enemy on this battlefield was not Cronus at all, but instead the fearsome and powerful son of the Titans Iapetus and Clymene. His name was Atlas. As the son of Iapetus and Clymene, Atlas is considered to be a second-generation Titan. Despite this youth, he did not lack for brute strength and tremendous power. I mean, any being that could give Zeus pause would certainly be a noteworthy adversary. Homer describes Atlas in the Odyssey as deadly minded, and that he knew the depths of all the seas, implying that not only was Atlas lethal, but that he was wise beyond the years of Zeus. Despite Cronus being the cause of the war in the first place, it was Atlas who was at the centre of the battles, leading the Titans against the freed Hecatoncheires, who with their 1,000 arms, launched boulders at them. There were also the recently regurgitated Olympians for Atlas and the Titans to worry about too, not to mention the occasional blast from Zeus's lightning bolts, one that in some legends actually destroyed Atlas's brother, an equally terrifying Titan named Menoetius. Could this have been the reason why Atlas was so hellbent on leading the charge against Zeus? Or was it simply a tribal thing, an us against them sort of mentality, in which Atlas would have rather stood on the side of the child-eating Cronus simply because he was a Titan himself? We know that not all the Titans sided with Cronus in the war. The other brothers of Atlas, Prometheus and Epimetheus, took the side of Zeus and were able to avoid much of, if not all of the conflict. So Atlas's motivations are not necessarily clear, but maybe he didn't much like the idea of having to bow down to a much smaller and perhaps seemingly inferior being as Zeus. When a battle was done and Zeus stood victorious, he did not show the surviving Titans much mercy at all. In fact, when it came to conquering his enemies, Zeus did not treat the stragglers of his opposition with anything but contempt. Hesiod tells us that Atlas suffered a terrible fate at the hands of his conqueror, and that was to bear on his back forever the cruel strength of the crushing world, and vault of the sky upon his shoulders the great pillar that holds apart the earth and heaven, a load not easy to be borne. So instead of just being killed off, which I think would have been better for him, Zeus decided to, in effect, kill a few birds with one stone, or with one lightning bolt, I guess. He not only established a means to hold up the sky, or the heavens in some wording, but also got to make an example out of Atlas. And who better to make an example out of than the most brutal Titan of them all, the war leader, no less. Whilst other Titans are seen to incur some nasty punishments, Atlas is by far the most extreme and perhaps the most famous. With someone holding up the sky, Zeus needn't have burdened himself with such a huge responsibility, and this of course gave him more time to go sleeping around the entire world with virtually anything with a pulse. Atlas, meanwhile, was forever forsaken to this endless burden, and at the junction of what would become Africa and Europe, he stood as firm as he could, locked in place, muscles straining, bones aching, his body in unimaginable agony as the weight of the sky rested on his shoulders. In other versions, Atlas is described as holding pillars far out in the Atlantic Ocean, which hold the heavens apart from the earth. The name Atlas is thought to have meant very enduring by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this is pretty fitting, given the task that Atlas must endure for the sake of not only himself, but for the entire world and all of its inhabitants. In this case, we can see Atlas in quite a selfless and heroic light, given that despite being defeated by Zeus, and despite Zeus's many children frolicking about beneath him, he never tries to shrug the skies off his shoulders, in an effort to bring about not just his end, but the end of Zeus. Zeus gives Atlas such a pivotal role in holding up the sky, and never once considers the fact that if Atlas broke free of it, all of their fates would be sealed. Perhaps he is playing on Atlas's good nature, knowing that the Titan would not drop the sky, because if he did, he'd be killing, well, everyone else. This show makes Atlas seem more like a tragic protagonist than a barbaric villain, who warred against Zeus. There is honour to Atlas in that he won't condemn others in order to be free of his terrible punishment, even if it means killing Zeus in the process. Despite desperately wanting freedom from his burden, he endures it, for the sake of everyone else, who, quite sadly, do not even know of his encumberment, or at least don't seem to care. He's hardly mentioned by the other characters in the mythology, and when others do find themselves in his presence, he usually ends up suffering even more. Another idea is that Zeus has bound Atlas to hold the sky in such a way that even if he wanted to drop it, he couldn't. This would literally make Atlas a prisoner devoid of any free will, and cursed to hold the heavens, not because he's morally good and choosing to spare people, but because he doesn't have a choice. Atlas here becomes less of a tragic hero and more of a bitter, defeated villain, one whose struggle is almost justified, given that he would not hesitate to destroy everyone, including himself, to be free. Another idea is that Atlas shares the selfishness of Cronus, in that he values his own life too much. He would rather live in such eternal agony forever and ever than end his own life, even if it brought about the relief he surely craves. Pride becomes another element here to Atlas's character, that he would rather endure the punishment than see himself obliterated, much less be the cause of it. One last idea is that Atlas will not drop the sky, because if he does, he would be crushing his daughters, those he had through the nymph Pleione. There was also the goddess nymph Calypso, and then the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, as well as their children, one being the god Hermes. In some versions, Atlas was also given children by the Oceanid Aethra, who bore him more daughters known as the Hyades, a sisterhood of nymphs who bring the rain, and his only son, Hyas. In some tales, Atlas is also the father of the evening and sunset nymphs known as the Hesperides, sometimes coined as the Atlantides, after their father. Some accounts have Atlas condemned to hold the sky at the west edges of the earth, right next to the garden of where the Hesperides lived. So by this, if he was to shrug the sky off his shoulders, he might very well have felt like he was killing them himself. Additionally, the Pleiades, who after being stalked by Orion, are eventually placed into the sky as a constellation by Zeus. So you might say that if Atlas was to drop the sky, he would also be hurtling his daughters down to their deaths as well. Here Atlas gets some nobleness assigned to him, in that he bears this weight not because of his pride or because of his own need for self-preservation, but for the sake of his daughters and grandchildren, so that they may live. In this, Atlas gives up his own life to infinite pain, so that his offspring may know the joys of life. You might say that Atlas sure had a rough deal, and he certainly was not a fortunate titan. Perhaps if he sided with Zeus, he might have gotten a better deal, although if you look at how Prometheus is treated thereafter, it might not have been for the best after all. But there exists an idea that Atlas was doomed to his fate from the very beginning, from before he was even born in fact. In some legends, when Gaia was begging her children to kill Cronus for her, she went to Iapetus and Clymene, who was pregnant at the time with Atlas and his brothers. When Iapetus and Clymene refused to help Gaia in her quest to murder the terrible Cronus, she cursed the pair of them, and more importantly, cursed their sons. Given how it plays out for the second generation Titans, it seems the curse was no simple bluff. In the entirety of Greek mythology, Atlas is only included in 2 stories, that which include 2 of the greatest Greek heroes, Heracles and Perseus. Many will be familiar with the 12 labours of Heracles, where after being driven mad by Hera, the queen of the gods, Heracles kills his own sons and his wife Megara. After recovering his sanity, he wished to atone for his grievous mistake, and after being advised by the Oracle of Delphi, Pythia, to seek employment from the king Eurystheus, Heracles agrees. It is the king who sets Heracles to perform 10 tasks, or 10 labours, those which he is able to achieve. But the king disputed the completion of 2 of these tasks, and so another 2 were added on. One was to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guards the gateway to Hades. The other was to fetch the legendary golden apples of the Hesperides, those being the daughters of Atlas. The issue was that Heracles didn't exactly know where to find the golden apples, but on his journey he did come across Atlas, still straining under the weight of the sky. Knowing that Atlas was their father, Heracles believed that if anyone knew where to find the Hesperides, it would be him. Atlas did indeed claim to know where they were, but he was pretty tight-lipped about it. So Heracles came to a compromise and offered to hold the sky for Atlas whilst Atlas went and brought the apples to him. Seeing a chance to be free of his burden, Atlas eagerly agreed, and so he and Heracles traded places. Atlas was free. But he did not pick up where he left off in his mission to destroy Zeus and the Olympians, possibly seeing how strong Zeus had grown, and probably painfully aware that there were no Titans left to lead. So instead, Atlas did indeed go and get the apples from his daughters, and return to Heracles. But when Heracles offered the sky back to him, Atlas declined and said that he would take the apples to the king instead, and that this holding up the sky business was now Heracles' problem. Atlas proves here to not only be scheming, but also still kind of noble. I mean, he could have just walked off after Heracles took hold of the sky, and not bothered to come back with the apples at all. But he lives up to his word, and even offers to help Heracles complete his quest, by taking the apples to the king instead. You might say that this was a consolation for Heracles by Atlas, who possibly didn't feel all that good about duping Heracles into this horrible fate, but couldn't stand suffering it himself any longer. It's almost as if Atlas had reached his breaking point and was so desperate to be free that it was not beneath him to rope someone else in to take on the burden. I guess you can hardly blame him, but again, at least he tries to offer some peace to Heracles by offering to fulfill his mission. If only Atlas was as smart as he was honourable, however. Realising the gravity of the situation, Heracles pretended to agree to Atlas's proposal and bore the weight of the sky on his shoulders. But after a few moments, he asked Atlas to take it back for just a second, so that he could place a few pillows on his shoulders to ease the strain. Sensing nothing amiss by this, and understanding the need for pillows like no one else can, Atlas took back the sky under the assumption that Heracles would fetch some pillows and come back. Instead, Heracles took the apples and walked off, and Atlas was imprisoned again. In other versions of this tale, Heracles is far more compassionate, and instead of leaving Atlas to his dreary fate, he builds two great pillars to hold the sky from the earth, thus liberating Atlas from his burden. The second encounter that Atlas has with the Greek heroes is Perseus, and this one implies a far more permanent end for the Titan. You might say that after having been duped by Heracles, Atlas was far more suspicious of man, and in a much worse mood. Because of this, he refused to let anyone into the vicinity of the golden apples, and would become something of a guardian for the elusive treasure. In another version, he is privy to a prophecy by an oracle, who tells him that one day a son of Zeus will come to steal the apples. So by this, he was hyper aware of the presence of Perseus, who emerged before him seeking hospitality in the land. In ancient Greece, the welcoming of guests and the offering of hospitality to weary travellers was a pretty big deal, and to deny a guest of such honours was seen to be something of a sin, and something most certainly punishable by the gods. But because of the prophecy, or because of his own suspicions and bitterness after having been outsmarted by Heracles, Atlas denied Perseus any form of welcome. Having already slain the Gorgon Medusa, Perseus still carried her head in his satchel, and the head was as potent as ever. Despite being severed, Perseus could still use her head as a weapon, in that anyone Medusa gazed upon would turn to stone. So Perseus lifted her head and forced its gaze upon Atlas, who immediately transformed into stone, or as the legend goes, into the mountain range in northwest Africa, now known as the Atlas Mountains. A common misconception is that Atlas was forced to hold the weight of the world on his shoulders, and that this has likely spawned out of the fact that he's been seen in classical art as holding a sphere, which is easily misconstrued as a globe. In fact, these spheres are the celestial spheres, which are cosmological models developed by the ancient astronomers to demonstrate or reflect the motion of stars. This idea of Atlas carrying the world may have been further reinforced by what we call a collection of maps, which is also an atlas. Atlas was most certainly an unfortunate character in Greek mythology, like much of his fellow Titans. He endured great hardship in the wake of the Titan defeat, and is subjugated to both a grueling and humiliating fate by the hands of Zeus. In a way, we can't help but feel bad for Atlas given his never-ending punishment, but I suppose we don't really get to see much of what he was like prior to his punishment. Whilst we understand he was ferocious on the battlefield, can we really blame him for defending himself against the rise of the Olympians, who sought to overthrow Cronus and take the world for themselves? Whilst many of the Titans are marginalised when compared to the new gods, Atlas is one that sticks out, most probably because of him being conducive to the survival of every other person. It's possible the ancient Greeks held Atlas in great reverence to some degree, given that it was he who, in a sense, kept them alive by not dropping the sky on them. Perhaps the saddest thing about Atlas is that in most accounts, after his encounter with Perseus and being turned to stone, he becomes the Atlas mountain range, where he loses his sentience, his character, and his very being. But let me know in the comments below what you thought about the Titan Atlas, and who you'd like to see next in this series of Greek mythology explained. As always, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.